The Kamigawa block is notorious for being home to some of Magic's most underperforming and failed mechanics. Perhaps none are as limiting or ineffective as Epic, a keyword ability found in Champions of Kamigawa that essentially removes most, if not all, the player's agency in their own game. Each color got exactly one card with the Epic keyword, and the mechanic was such a failure with such little design space that the mechanic was never revisited directly. Epic is as simple as it is restrictive. When a player resolves a spell with Epic, they are no longer able to cast spells for the rest of the game. In exchange for this massive drawback, the player gets to copy the spell with Epic on their upkeep, except for the Epic ability, and chooses new targets for the copy if they wish. Essentially, once you cast an Epic spell, you are only allowed to use that spell for the rest of the game once you're in each of your upkeep steps. It doesn't matter what cards you draw, regardless of if it's another Epic spell, or even the same Epic spell as the one you cast. Enduring Ideal has a mana value of 7 and searches an enchantment from your library and puts it onto the battlefield. Eternal Dominion costs 10 mana and searches your opponent's library for a permanent and lets you put it onto the battlefield under your control. Never-Ending Torment costs 6 mana and lets you search and exile cards from your opponent's library up to the number of cards in your hand. Undying Flames exile cards from the top of your library until you hit a non-land and then deals damage equal to that card's mana value while having a mana value of 6 itself. And for 8 mana, Endless Swarm makes a 1/1 snake creature token for each card in your hand. And once you've cast one of these, they'll be the last spell you cast as it copies itself again on each upkeep. That's not to say you're completely locked from playing the game, however. While you can't cast spells, Epic needs you to be able to put copies of spells on the stack to reuse the Epic spell. And as such, other effects that specifically make copies of spells work while under Epic, although this is a somewhat narrow application. More generally, you can still play lands, can still use activated abilities on permanents you control, or abilities that work outside of the battlefield, and can attack or block with creatures. This is about the extent of what a player under the effects of Epic is allowed to do, beyond the specific effect of the spell they cast in the first place. If you don't have any permanents on board, or if your opponent removes them, your options get more and more limited until you're left doing very little with your turn. The most common play pattern for someone under the effects of Epic is to resolve their spell's effect in the upkeep, then almost instantly pass through their phases to their opponent's turn. One of the strengths of a Magic deck is having a variety of cards that support each other. While decks tend to want to be focused on a specific strategy or game plan, generally they also want to be flexible enough to answer potential problems from your opponent. Oftentimes, a Magic card is played less for its raw power level, but for how versatile it can be in various situations for various types of matchups. Epic, however, forces the player to forgo all options not presented directly on the Epic card itself. This leaves a player with the deck focused solely on this Epic spell, with pretty much every other card in the deck becoming meaningless after the Epic spell is played. For example, Undying Flames deals damage based on the mana value of your other cards. This encourages you to build a deck with high mana cost spells. However, that just means that the turns you're waiting to cast this 6 mana Epic spell are spent with a handful of cards you cannot cast, and most of the other Epic spells don't even care about the cards in your deck. Generally, the most effective way of building around an Epic card is to ramp your mana and or search your deck for the Epic spell to play it as fast as possible. After all, when most of your cards stop working after you play your deck's key spell, it's hard to rely on those cards much, if at all. You also tend to want permanents that will protect you from your opponent, or at the very least, slow them down long enough for you to get things going. This would maybe be passable if the Epic spells had especially strong effects. However, a card like Endless Swarm isn't even all that strong. Given Magic's maximum hand size limit of 7, unless you used a card like Reliquary Tower, your maximum output every turn would be 7 1/1 snake tokens. Compare this to a card like Avenger of Zendikar, which can often provide more tokens than Endless Swarm when it enters the battlefield, as well as a way to make those tokens more threatening by giving all your creatures +1/+1 counters. All of this while also not preventing you from casting other spells in response to your opponent interacting with you. With all that in mind, it's not hard to see that the Epic spells fall flat in comparison. You have no way of making these snake tokens any stronger, so all you can do is hope that you eventually make enough snakes to overwhelm your opponent. This, of course, requires your tiny snakes to survive alongside you, which is easier said than done. And some Epic spells aren't even so lucky as to be self-sufficient like that. The blue Epic spell, Eternal Dominion, takes a permanent of your choice from your opponent's deck and places it onto the battlefield under your control. This could be a potent effect. The card Bribery is an old school staple card that still shows up in Commander's games. However, it requires an opponent to have a deck full of permanents worth stealing, which is not always a guarantee, and especially not in competitive formats. Even if your opponent's deck is permanent focus, there's no guarantee your opponent's cards will even work for you without the synergies of their original deck. Never-Ending Torment also searches your opponent's deck, but instead exile cards equal to the number of cards you have in your hand. On paper, this may sound better, as some combo decks might not be able to do their combo if you exile the right cards. However, all you've done is remove their primary win condition, and are doing nothing that actually advances your own game. You're essentially hoping that your opponent can't draw into a way to kill you before they run out of cards in their deck. And that's assuming you're in a matchup where your opponent's deck is weak to this form of interaction. All of this ties back to the idea that Epic limits and removes your options when you need them the most. Effects that are strong on one-off cards are much weaker when it's the only spell you're able to cast. You need to both be able to protect yourself and hope that whatever your win condition is, that it works against your opponent. And even then, there's not much active play involved in this on your end. As one Magic designer put it, Epic as a mechanic essentially turns the player into an AI for the other player to go up against. This tends to not be very fun for the player, since their agency in the game is lost as they go through the motions of whatever their Epic spell dictates. And just like an AI opponent, this means your moves are all telegraphed. Your opponent knows what your Epic spell was, and if it's one of the spells that searches their deck, your opponent obviously knows their own deck's contents even better than you. You have no ability to bluff because the cards in your hand rarely, if ever, matter anymore. The only creatures your opponent has to fear are the ones already on board, or that are being brought out by the Epic spell that they saw coming. Even if the opponent is matched up poorly against your Epic spell of choice, all they simply have to do is counter it, and you're suddenly left scrambling for another copy to use. It's not hard to see why Epic was a flop. However, that's not to say it's completely without a competitive history. While most of the time in Magic, white gets the short end of the color pie, the white Epic spell is far and away the most playable of the group. Enduring Ideal is a 7-mana sorcery that searches your library for an enchantment and puts it onto the battlefield on each of your upkeeps. This is the only Epic spell that cares what type of cards are in your deck, not just how expensive they are. It's also the only one that gives the player options, with enchantments existing in all colors with answers for any sort of situation. Generally, the player would use enchantments like Dovescape and Ivory Mask to protect themselves from your opponent before eventually ending the game with a card like Form of Dragon. This deck was mainly playable back in the days of Expanded format. Expanded was the predecessor to today's modern format. It still had a rotating card pool, but instead went back a few years into the available set to allow for more stable decks that were less prone to rotation. It was during an Expanded Grand Prix in 2008 where Enduring Ideal would see its only major event top where it saw 5th place. Enduring Ideal would always be more of a deck at lower levels such as regional Pro Tour qualifier events. Even after Expanded was replaced with Modern, the deck survived, existing as a rogue option in Modern and Legacy to this day. Of course, with it only having one major top event ever, and that being over a decade ago, it's hard to say that Enduring Ideal is a very competitive deck. After all, if your opponent has removal for your enchantments before you can establish a proper board, then you're basically already dead. On the flip side, if your opponent doesn't have any answers in their deck, then it's a slow but almost undeniable win for the Enduring Ideal player. Regardless of who's winning the game tends to be essentially over the moment Enduring Ideal is cast. It just becomes a question of if your opponent has an answer or not. With modern support, this strategy has gotten even stronger. Enchantments like Solemnity, printed years after Enduring Ideal, have given it more options into locking the game. However, many white enchantment decks that play a similar game plan choose to forego Enduring Ideal and its downside altogether and play a more general enchantment control strategy. With the most playable Epic card being mostly ignored in the sorts of deck that would want it the most, it's easy to say that Epic has completely fallen by the wayside. Not many people want to play a card that actively tells them to stop casting spells entirely. There has not been a single new spell with Epic as an ability since the initial cycle of 5 in Champions of Kamigawa, and there's no secret as to why. The head designer for Wizards of the Coast has even said that Epic has perhaps the least design space of any mechanic they've ever printed. It's a difficult task to make a card so powerful a player feels okay with only casting it for the rest of the game. It's even more difficult to make a card like that that's fun to play against. Most effects in the game would be horrible if they were the only spell you were allowed to cast. There's no point in casting a card even as powerful as Ancestral Recall if you're not allowed to use the cards in your hand. If an Epic spell is too weak, nobody will ever dare build their entire deck around it. If an Epic spell is too powerful, it simply makes for games where the Epic player wins the same way every time, or loses because your opponent had the exact answer needed, and there's nothing left for the Epic player to do. As such, Wizards of the Coast opted to shelve the Epic spells and have expressed no desire to ever return to them. However, that's not to say the design philosophy behind Epic spells was entirely abandoned. The original Kamigawa block was themed specifically around the idea of legendary cards. While the Epic spells were not legendary in terms of their actual card type, the design goal behind the mechanic was to create non-permanent spells that felt legendary. This was the first time Magic had really considered the legendary rule as anything other than a drawback or a flavorful word. They intended to make the spells flashy and powerful, but also fair. Coverage from Wizards during Champions of Kamigawa spoiler season remarked on how many of the negative points already mentioned as things they aimed to avoid. Wizards at the time were aware they needed to make these cards powerful yet interactive, able to win the game yet not overpowering. However, like many things in the Kamigawa block, these ideas, although built on solid ground, were not built up in a cohesive way. After all, despite being meant to feel legendary, they didn't even give the Epic spells a legendary typing, meaning that it lacked help from even the support from the limited environment that cared about legendary cards. This brings us to the set Dominaria from 2018. Dominaria was also a set themed specifically around legendary cards, and brought with it its own form of legendary non-permanents. This time around, they were actually legendary, with 6 sorceries each having the super type in the set. This was unprecedented, although the groundworks were laid by the epic spells all those years ago. At surface level, they share many similarities to their predecessors. Like the epic spells, they are fairly expensive sorceries that have a drawback to make up for their effects. However, these legendary sorceries, like Karn's Temporal Sundering, only require you to already have a legendary permanent on the field to be allowed to cast the spell. The downside is far more manageable, requiring some manner of focus and deck building consideration without completely shutting you off from removing options. While none of these spells have seen competitive tournament play since their printing, they at least show a modernization of designs and ideas present in epic spells. And unlike epic spells, the design space of legendary sorceries is enough that they could go back and add more of them and even support them in the future. And beyond the world of competitive formats, the Commander format is already built around having a legendary creature lead your deck, and thus these legendary sorceries become powerful tech options in the format for the right decks. Epic is unarguably one of Magic's least successful mechanics. While initially conceived as a way to bring the flash and flavor of legendary cards and non-permanents, they wound up instead of being a quintet of middling to bad cards that made the game all about them. It simply is too much to ask to only be able to use one spell for the rest of the game, especially when most of the spells are lacking in any actual potent effects. And even when there is a spell with Epic that's strong, it tends to be more of a gimmicky rogue deck that steals wins off the back of opponents being ill-equipped to face it more than it does its own game plan. Epic was such a failure of a mechanic that not only will it likely never come back, but new mechanics and ideas have been created in the years since then to try and fill the same niche it was angled to take. As it turns out, when people are playing a card game, one of the last things they'll want to do is play something that tells them to stop playing other cards. Alright, and that's the video. If you have any other ideas for other failed cards or mechanics, we'd love to hear about those ideas down in the comments below.